This is lesson 14.3, Conquest and Settlement, and this one's relatively short, and I know you'll appreciate that. And so the question is, how did European powers acquire colonies in the Americas, and how were they governed? College Board 1.1, we're still on that, contextualizing the Renaissance and discovery, and it says, once again, explain the context in which the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery developed. Europeans explored and settled overseas territories, encountering and interacting with indigenous populations. We've seen that before. And then it says European nations were driven by commercial and religious motives to explore overseas territories and establish colonies. That also looks familiar. Topic 1.6, we've also seen that one. Technological advances and the age of exploration. Explain the motivations for and the effects of European exploration and expansion from our first period, 1450 and to 1648. Christianity was a stimulus for exploration as governments and religious authorities sought to spread the faith, and for some, it served as a justification for the subjugation of indigenous civilizations. So we've seen that before, and we'll see that here. This is new, though. Rivals on the world stage, topic 1.7. Explain how and why trading networks and colonial expansion affected relations between and among European states. The Spanish established colonies across the Americas, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, which made Spain a dominant state in Europe in the 16th century. The Atlantic nations of France, England, and the Netherlands followed by establishing their own colonies and trading networks to compete with Portuguese and Spanish dominance in the 17th century. So we'll see some of that. And then topic 1.8, colonial expansion and, this is huge, the Columbian Exchange. Explain the economic impact of European colonial expansion and the development of trade networks. The Portuguese established a commercial network along the African coast, in South and East Asia, and in South America in the late 15th and throughout the 16th centuries. And then we're coming full circle once again, topic 111, Causation in the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery. Explain the context in which the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery developed. Europeans explored and settled overseas territories, encountering and interacting with indigenous populations, and European nations were driven by commercial and religious motives to explore overseas territories and establish colonies. Whew. Okay, well, here is our map right there. We've got on the bottom left the Portuguese colonial trade empire, and on the top right we've got the Spanish colonial trade empire. And so we've got several new people: Hernan Cortez, we've got Francisco Pizarro, Montezuma, and Atahualpa. Spanish conquest of the Aztec. The Spanish had already settled in Hispaniola, as we know, and also in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and other Caribbean islands. The Americas had anywhere between 35 and 50 million people living there in 1492, and their lives were radically transformed. The first real conquistador was Hernan Cortez, and he lived from 1485 to 1547. He was a professional soldier, and he landed on the Mexican coast from Cuba in April of 1519. And Cortez quickly realized that the Aztecs subject peoples, whom the Aztecs had used for, number one, forced labor, number two, human sacrifices, and it's not on the slide, but number three, also fighting practice, resented their Aztec overlords. And Hernan Cortez exploited this resentment among these surrounding peoples, and he attacked Tenochtitlán in November 1519. And Hernan Cortez had just a few hundred soldiers, Spanish soldiers, very few guns, very few horses. But Hernan Cortez had over 6,000 angry natives allied with him. So Montezuma thought that the Spanish were invincible, and he hesitated to attack because he thought that Hernan Cortez might be a god. And Montezuma himself was killed by Cortez almost immediately. And in the ensuing battle, Hernán Cortés was forced to retreat. Well, in 1521, Hernán Cortés launched a second attack on the Aztecs, and this time Cortés had 1,000 Spanish soldiers and, get this, 75,000 native warriors. Cortés was also aided by the effects of smallpox on the siege. But even with all that, it was still a very hard-won victory for Hernán Cortés. And after that, the rest of Mexico was systematically conquered by the Spanish, place by place. So that takes us to the Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire. The Inca were already weakened by disease and civil war by the time of the Spanish invasion. Spanish conquistador Francisco Pizarro, who lived from somewhere around 1474 to 1541, murdered the Incan ruler Atahualpa after taking him hostage and demanding huge amounts of gold and silver for ransom, which he got, and then murdered Atahualpa anyway. And then Pizarro marched to the Incan capital of Cusco in 1533, and he plundered it. And then the Portuguese in Brazil. Keep in mind, according to that Treaty of Tordesillas, the Portuguese get Brazil because South America is sticking out eastward over that line. So the Brazilian territory was not like Mexico and not like Peru. The Brazilian territory was made up of just small tribes. There were no urban empires like Mexico and the Incas had. Sugarcane introduced the first use of indigenous people as slaves. Now, you got to know some things about sugarcane. Sugarcane grows year-round. Processing sugar is very labor-intensive, and if you don't process it within like 24 hours after you harvest it, it starts to go bad. So it has to be done quickly. And it's very hard work, and native slaves died off very quickly. And the deaths of indigenous people was so severe that the Portuguese had to import slaves from Africa. And they developed a new form of colonization, which you're all familiar with, and that is the form of large plantations worked by slaves. And this became the model for sugar production throughout the New World. And then not just sugar production, was it? Also all kinds of other production like tobacco and cotton. Colonial empires of England and France. The English established, as you know, the Virginia colony of Jamestown in 1607, and enslaved Africans replaced indentured servants on these tobacco and rice plantations. And English colonization was not like Spanish or Portuguese colonization. It was haphazard, and it was decentralized. And so English colonists enjoyed greater colonial autonomy than either the Spanish or the Portuguese. And these colonies were often settled by radical Protestants escaping Anglican oppression. And these colonies also tended to hug the coastline, and they tended to exclude indigenous people. And English colonies were allowed to have legislative assemblies, and these were dominated by wealthy landowners and merchants, but commoners got more say in colonial government than they got over in England. The French also established trading factories in present-day Canada. Colonial administration. The Spanish organized two new territories, New Spain and Peru, and these new territories were called viceroyalties. The Portuguese organized a system of what they called captaincies in Brazil. Brazil was merely part, as you can see on this map, of the vast global trade network that Portugal established that included Africa, East Asia, South America in the late 15th and throughout the 16th centuries. The Catholic Church played a role in Spanish and Portuguese rule throughout the Americas. The Catholic Church was eager to bring Christianity to the New World, and they sent missionaries throughout the Spanish and Portuguese colonies to convert native populations to Christianity. Converting Native Americans to Christianity turned out to be an aid to the Spanish in their efforts to dominate the area. People are easier to rule if they have accepted your religion as their religion. We've got a picture here of the very earliest Ursuline sisters with Amerindian pupils at Quebec City. Numerous Northern European powers established fortified trading posts in West Africa and India, and these included England and France and Denmark and others. Unlike the English, who gave their colonies lots of autonomy, the French crown imposed direct rule over its colonies. So here's a picture of the French taking possession of Louisiana and the Mississippi River in the name of Louis XIV.